Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle a really interesting, maybe even provocative idea.
Yeah, it's from Frank Turek's book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case.
Right. And our mission, our goal for this deep dive is really to unpack Turek's central argument.
Which is essentially his claim that atheists, when they argue against God, well, they often end up using concepts, think morality, reason that he believes, only really hold up if you have a theistic worldview.
Exactly. So we'll be looking directly at parts of his book to get a handle on this perspective.
Think of it like this. We're trying to give you a clear path to understanding this specific viewpoint. You might even have some, aha moments about the assumptions hiding beneath the surface in these kinds of debates.
Okay, sounds good. So let's get into the main arguments. Where does Turek start?
He kicks off with a classic, the problem of evil. It's probably the most common argument against God, right?
Exactly.
So he sets up this mental two-column chart. Evidence for God on one side, evidence against on the other.
Okay, what's on the for God side?
It's a pretty long list. The universe having a beginning, the fine-tuning of everything for life, the fact that we have consistent laws of nature.
Like physics.
Yeah, exactly. Then reason itself, like logic and math, the information in DNA, this sense of intentionality, life existing at all, mind, consciousness,
Free will,
objective morality, that sense of real, right and wrong, beauty, pleasure, even Old Testament prophecies, and of course the life and resurrection of Jesus. Quite a list.
Wow. Okay. And the against God side?
Just one thing, evil.
That's it. Just evil.
According to his chart, yes. And this is where his main point really starts taking shape.
How so?
He says, okay, evil is definitely a problem for Christianity, no doubt. But, he argues, everything else on that for God list, those are like massive problems for atheism.
So he's flipping it around.
Right. He contends that evil is actually an even bigger issue for atheism because from that perspective, where does evil come from? Is there even a real basis to call something evil?
Yeah.
And is there any ultimate solution?
And this leads back to that stealing idea.
Exactly. When an atheist points to suffering or injustice and says, this is wrong, Turek's argument is that they're using a moral measuring stick.
A standard of what ought to be.
Precisely. And he claims they've essentially borrowed that standard from a theistic framework, one that assumes a fundamentally good and just God as the source of that standard.
Okay. So, moving beyond just the problem of evil, he looks at other arguments for God and how atheists respond.
Yeah, he does. Let's start with the universe having a beginning, the cosmological argument.
The idea that something can't just come from absolutely nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit.
Right. He mentions his earlier book with Norm Geisler, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, touching on this.
Now, you often hear the idea, Stephen Hawking talked about it, that maybe gravity created the universe from nothing.
Yes, and Turek brings up John Lennox's counter-argument here, which is pretty clear.
What's the counter?
Lennox points out that gravity isn't some independent creative force. It's part of the universe. It came into being with the universe.
Ah, okay. So it couldn't have existed before the universe to create it.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Saying gravity created the universe is sort of like saying the laws of chess existed before the game itself. It's putting the cart before the horse.
Got it. What about Lawrence Krauss? His book, A Universe from Nothing, made a big splash.
Turek discusses that too. He notes some significant criticisms, like David Albert's review in the New York Times, which basically questioned if Krauss's nothing was really nothing at all.
Meaning it might have been some kind of quantum field or pre-existing physical state.
Something like that, yeah. Turek also brings up the Bordguth-Vilenkin theorem, the BGV theorem. It's heavy physics. But the gist, even from Vilenkin himself, is that any universe like ours that's been expanding throughout its history probably can't be eternal in the past. It needs a beginning.
That seems pretty significant coming from cosmologists. Now, what about the comparison atheists sometimes make, like, I don't believe in God, just like I don't believe in Santa Claus?
Turek tackles that one directly. He says it's not a good analogy.
Right.
Well, with Santa, he argues, we don't just lack evidence for him. We have positive evidence against him. Think about the logistics. One guy, one night, all the houses. It's physically impossible.
Okay.
But with God, Turek claims, there is positive evidence for existence. All those things in his first column. And crucially, no definitive proof that God cannot exist.
So absence of belief isn't the same as evidence of absence, especially when there's positive evidence on the other side.
That's the idea. He also touches on God being a necessary being,
Yep.
meaning God's existence isn't dependent on anything else, unlike everything in the universe.
Interesting.
And what's really interesting is that Turek points out, even Krauss admitted there seems to be an apparent logical necessity of first cause. And Richard Dawkins actually conceded that you can make a reasonably respectable case for a deistic God.
A creator God who doesn't intervene.
Yeah. Which, coming from Dawkins, is quite something.
It really is. Okay, let's shift to another big one. The fine-tuning argument. The idea that the universe's physical constants are just incredibly precise for life.
Exactly. The teleological argument. Turek mentions William Lane Craig's extensive work on this. The numbers are just staggering: gravity, electromagnetism, the nuclear forces.
Yeah.
If they were off by even a tiny fraction, life as we know it couldn't exist.
And the common rebuttal is the anthropic principle, right? Well, if it wasn't fine-tuned, we wouldn't be here talking about it.
Precisely. It sounds logical on the surface. But Turek uses an analogy from philosopher John Leslie to counter it.
The firing squad analogy.
That's the one. Imagine you're sentenced to death by a firing squad of, say, 100 expert marksmen. They all fire. And they all miss.
Okay, I'd be relieved.
You'd be relieved, sure. But would you just shrug and say, well, obviously they missed because I'm still alive to observe it?
No, I'd definitely be wondering why they all missed. Was it intentional? Did they collude?
Exactly. You wouldn't just accept your survival as explaining the event. You'd look for a reason behind it. Turek argues the fine-tuning is like that our existence doesn't automatically explain why the conditions are so perfect. It points, he says, towards an intelligence, a fine-tuner.
That's a really effective way to frame it. What about less tangible things, like logic and math?
Right. These are fundamental. We rely on them for everything, especially science. But they aren't physical objects. You can't put logic in a test tube.
So where do they come from in a purely material universe?
That's the question Turek raises, citing Jinn. How does atheism account for these universal, unchanging, immaterial laws of thought? He argues they fit much more comfortably within a theistic worldview, suggesting they reflect the mind of a rational creator.
And that connects to the information content in DNA.
Absolutely, the genetic code. It's not just complex chemistry, it's specified information. Dawkins himself compared the information in a single cell to volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
That's an incredible amount of information.
It is. Turek highlights work by folks like Bradley and Thaxton, arguing DNA functions like a language, a code. And where do codes come from?
From intelligence.
Yeah.
Programmers, writers.
Exactly. Stephen Meyer, in Signature in the Cell, argues this informational signature points directly to an intelligent mind.
And Meyer also wrote Darwin's Doubt.
Yes, where he tackles the Cambrian explosion, that certain burst of diverse animal life in the fossil record, arguing it's better explained by infusions of information, by intelligent design, rather than just gradual Darwinian processes.
Casey Luskin's work on molecular machines fits here too, right? The
Yeah.
intricate biological machinery in cells.
Yeah, the flagellar motor, ATP synthase, incredibly complex, coordinated systems that seem designed.
Okay, so the argument from design applies at the cosmic, logical, and biological levels. Now, let's get back to morality, because that seems central to this stealing claim.
It absolutely is. Objective morality. The idea that some things are truly right or wrong, regardless of what anyone thinks. Turek's core assertion is that atheists steal this concept from God whenever they make a moral judgment.
So when someone says that's unfair or that's evil,
They're appealing to a standard that Turek believes doesn't actually have a foundation in a purely materialistic, atheistic worldview. Where would such a standard come from if we're just, products of undirected evolution?
Richard Dawkins ties morality to Darwinian evolution, doesn't he? Survival advantages and so on.
He does. But Turek points out the potential implications. He brings up comments Dawkins made after the terrible Megan Kenka murder. The suggestion seemed to be that from a purely evolutionary standpoint, it's hard to find a truly objective basis to condemn such an act beyond, perhaps, societal disapproval or genetic legacy.
That's unsettling.
It is. Turek contrasts this with C.S. Lewis's point in Mere Christianity, that across cultures and history, you find this underlying common moral code, the Tao, suggesting something deeper, something objective.
What about attempts to ground morality in something like well-being, like Sam Harris proposes in The Moral Landscape?
Turek critiques that too, referencing William Lane Craig. Craig's point is, well, what about a happy sociopath? If someone genuinely increases their own sense of well-being by harming others, Does Harris's system have grounds to condemn them if well-being is the ultimate measure?
That's a tough question for that view.
It is. Turick's position is that these basic moral truths, don't murder, be fair, be honest, feel self-evident, because they ultimately derive from the unchanging good nature of God. He notes the American founders referring to nature's law and nature's God.
So the laws aren't arbitrary commands, but reflections of God's character.
That's the idea. He also argues against easily excusing bad behavior by blaming genes if you don't have an objective standard above the genes to appeal to. Even Nietzsche, who famously critiqued Christian morality, was still operating within a world where moral concepts matter.
And Turek points out that atheists themselves often react with real moral outrage.
Yes, thinkers like Thomas Nagel or James Q. Wilson have noted this too. That deep sense of injustice, that feeling that something should not be, seems to betray an underlying belief in objective right and wrong, even if it's explicitly denied intellectually.
It's like an intuitive moral compass. Okay, what about mind and consciousness? Another big challenge for materialism.
Definitely. Materialism, the idea that only matter and energy exist, is the dominant view in atheism. But explaining consciousness, subjective experience, thoughts, feelings, purely in terms of physical stuff like neurons firing, that's proven incredibly difficult. It's the hard problem of consciousness.
Turek mentions Francis Crick's astonishing hypothesis.
Right, the attempt to reduce mind entirely to brain activity. But many philosophers and even scientists find that reduction leaves something essential out, the experience itself. The mind-body problem is still very much a problem.
He also brings up personal identity.
Yeah, if you're just your physical body, but all your cells are replaced over, say, 7 years, are you the same person? What provides that continuity of identity? It's easier to explain if there's an immaterial soul or mind.
And research on the spiritual brain.
People like Mario Beauregard and Denise O'Leary have explored neurological correlates of spiritual experiences, suggesting the brain is receptive to more than just the physical. Philosophers like Ed Feser also make strong arguments against materialism being able to account for the mind.
And the last piece in this section is free will.
Turek links free will to genuine love and moral accountability. If we're just complex biological machines whose actions are determined by prior causes...
And are we really making choices? Are we truly responsible?
Exactly. And can you truly love someone if you're just programmed to? He argues free will makes more sense if we're more than just matter.
Okay, that covers a lot of the arguments for God that Turek discusses. Now, let's circle back to how he addresses the main argument against God, the problem of evil.
Right. Having laid out why he thinks atheism struggles with other areas, he now tackles evil from his theistic perspective. He starts with C.S. Lewis's idea of evil as a privation.
A lack or corruption of good, not a thing in itself.
Exactly. Like darkness isn't a substance, it's the absence of light. Rust isn't a thing, it's the decay of metal. So evil is a twisting or absence of the good that God created.
So God being the ultimate good can't be evil.
Right. Evil needs good to exist, like a parasite needs a host. This also means he rejects dualism, the idea of equal, opposing forces of good and evil. Good is fundamental, evil is derivative.
And how did this privation enter the world, according to this view?
Through free will. God gave beings like angels and humans the capacity to choose, and some chose to turn away from the good, introducing evil and suffering.
But what about those really difficult Old Testament passages? God commanding violence against the Canaanites, for instance. That seems like more than just allowing evil.
Turek addresses this head-on. He stresses understanding the specific historical context. These were often judgments against cultures engaged in practices like child sacrifice, and distinguishing between God's commands within that specific covenantal context and his universal moral character, which is fully revealed in Jesus.
He mentions Jesus' teachings on divorce as an example.
Yeah, where Jesus points back to God's original ideal while acknowledging the Mosaic law made concessions due to human hardness of heart. Jesus came, Turek emphasizes, citing Matthew 5, not to abolish the law, but to fulfill its deeper meaning.
He also brings up some controversial modern statements again.
Yes, like Dawkins comparing a fetus to a pig, or Peter Singer advocating for infanticide in some cases. Turek presents these as, perhaps, disturbingly logical outcomes if you start from certain atheistic premises about personhood and value, contrasting them sharply with a Judeo-Christian view of inherent human dignity.
Okay, but what about natural evil? Earthquakes, diseases, how does free will explain those?
Turk suggests free will plays a role, maybe not always directly causing the event, but certainly in how we respond, and sometimes in exacerbating the consequences. For example, choosing to build homes in known earthquake zones or floodplains.
But that doesn't seem to cover everything, like a child getting cancer.
No, and he acknowledges that. He strongly cautions against the prosperity gospel, the idea that faith guarantees health and wealth. That's not biblical, he argues.
But what is the biblical perspective on suffering?
It's complex. It includes God's presence with us in suffering, the promise that he will ultimately overcome it, citing John 16:33, and also the idea that suffering, though painful, can produce good character, perseverance, and hope, citing Romans 5, James 1, Hebrews 12.
The idea of redemption or growth through hardship.
Yes. He also brings up the ripple effect or butterfly effect.
Huh?
Maybe an event that seems purely tragic from our limited perspective could have unforeseen positive consequences in the grand scheme of things. He references William Lane Craig and even the movie Sliding Doors, or Andy Andrews' work on this.
That requires a lot of trust in a bigger picture we can't see.
It does. Turek affirms God's sovereignty, his ultimate authority and right to judge, citing Isaiah 45:7, but balances it with the promise of Romans 8:28, that God works all things together for the good of those who love him.
And the ultimate answer lies in the future.
Ultimately, yes. The Christian hope is rooted in the promise of a future restoration, an afterlife where God will wipe away every tear and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, as described in Revelation 21:4. Evil gets the final defeat.
That provides a framework at least. Turek also spends time on science, which is crucial since science is often seen as undermining belief in God.
Very important, yes. He makes a key distinction right away. Differentiate between science as a method and the interpretations or philosophical conclusions drawn by scientists.
Can you give an example?
He uses the O.J. Simpson trial. The DNA evidence showed incredibly high probabilities, yet public perception and the jury's verdict were different. The scientific facts didn't automatically lead to a single conclusion in people's minds.
So scientists might interpret the same data differently based on their starting assumptions.
Exactly, especially when dealing with origins in the start of the universe, the origin of life.
Yeah.
These are historical events, not repeatable lab experiments. We're making inferences based on the evidence we find now.
He has a clever point about creating life in the lab too, right?
Yeah, he says if scientists did manage to create life from non-life in a lab, who would have done it?
Intelligent scientists.
Right. So he argues that wouldn't prove life arises spontaneously. It would prove it takes intelligence to create life. It would be evidence for intelligent design.
Huh, that's a neat turnaround. He mentions the demarcation problem.
Yes, citing physicist Sean Carroll, it's the philosophical puzzle of drawing a clear line between what counts as science and what doesn't. It's not as simple as people often think.
And he points to scientists who do see evidence for design.
Definitely. He lists authors like Michael Behe, Darwin's Black Box, Jonathan Wells, Icons of Evolution, Stephen Meyer, and organizations like the Discovery Institute, who argue that the biological evidence actually points away from purely unguided neo-Darwinism and towards intelligent design.
He also includes that strong quote from Richard Lewontin.
Yes, the one about scientists having a prior commitment to materialism and being willing to accept counterintuitive scientific claims because they cannot allow a divine foot in the door. It highlights the potential role of philosophical bias.
So the debate isn't always just about the evidence itself.
Often, it's about the lens through which the evidence is viewed. Turek also asks, where did the laws of nature come from in the first place? Science uses these laws, describes them, but can it explain their origin?
And science needs those laws to be consistent and orderly to even work.
Precisely. He notes again Dawkins' acknowledgement of the universe's fine-tuning, the immense information content in DNA, pointing to huge databases like NCBI, and the recent discovery via the ENCODE project that junk DNA isn't junk at all. It's highly functional.
These discoveries seem to strengthen the design argument.
Turek argues they do. Meyer suggests intelligent design actually makes testable predictions. Turek cites physicist Robert Mifflin on the anthropic principle, making the universe seem like a deliberate setup for life, and quotes astronomers like Robert Jastrow acknowledging the evidence points to a beginning.
He also raises the issue of scientific integrity.
Yeah, just reminding us that scientists are human. He mentions meta-analyses showing that fabrication or falsification of research does happen, unfortunately. We shouldn't assume scientists are always purely objective interpreters of data.
And he loops back to the mind consciousness problem.
Right, citing Thomas Nagel again, arguing materialism fundamentally struggles to account for subjective experience. And finally, he points out that science itself rests on philosophical assumptions that nature is uniform, that our senses are reliable, that logic works.
Assumptions that Turek believes fit better in a theistic framework.
That's his case. Science is a powerful tool, but it operates within a larger framework of understanding reality.
Okay, so after laying all this groundwork, Turek sums up his positive case for Christianity in 4 main points.
Yes, what he calls his case for mere Christianity, borrowing from Lewis. 4 steps.
What are they?
1. Objective truth exists. We can know things are true in reality. 2. God exists. He argues God is the best explanation for all the things we've discussed at the beginning: fine-tuning, morality, information, reason, etc.
3.
3. Miracles are possible. If a powerful God exists who created the universe, then suspending natural laws for a specific purpose isn't logically impossible for him.
Makes sense if step 2 is true. And 4.
4. Jesus is God. This is based on evidence for the historical reliability of the New Testament documents, fulfilled prophecy, and centrally, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection.
He elaborates on the evidence for the New Testament.
Yes, quite a bit. He talks about the sheer number of early manuscripts compared to other ancient works, archaeological finds that confirm details in the accounts like the Gallio inscription in Corinth or Sir William Ramsay's findings in Asia Minor confirming Luke's accuracy.
What about internal evidence?
He mentions work by Lydia McGrew on the internal consistency and undesigned coincidences within the Gospels, and argues for their basis in eyewitness accounts, citing former cold case detective J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity.
Plus fulfilled prophecy and the resurrection.
Right. The argument that numerous specific Old Testament prophecies pointed to Jesus, and that the resurrection is the best explanation for the empty tomb, the disciples' transformation from fearful cowards to bold martyrs, and the explosion of the early church.
So that's his cumulative case. How does he wrap up the book?
With a focus on faith and choice. He emphasizes that biblical faith isn't blind belief.
It's trust based on evidence.
Exactly. He uses Hebrews 11 and 12. Faith is trusting in a trustworthy God who has given reasons to trust him. It involves the whole person, mind, heart, will, referencing Jesus' command to love God with all your being.
So God invites investigation?
Yes. Turek cites Isaiah 1.8. Come now, let us reason together. 1 Peter 3.15. Be ready to give a reason for your hope. 2 Corinthians 10.5. Demolish arguments against God. 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ wasn't raised, faith is futile. God isn't asking for irrationality.
He uses a marriage analogy.
Right. You need both belief that your spouse is faithful and trust in your spouse for the relationship to work. Faith involves both assent to facts and relational trust. He quotes John 20.31, "The Gospels were written so that you might believe Jesus is the Christ."
He includes that powerful summary of Jesus' life.
Yeah, adapted from James Allen Francis' The One Solitary Life passage, emphasizing Jesus' unparalleled impact despite having no worldly power or status.
And he doesn't shy away from sin and judgment.
No. He talks about the reality of sin falling short of God's standard, Romans 3.23, and its consequences. Referencing Romans 1, he affirms hell as a real possibility, citing biblical passages, but frames it using C.S. Lewis's idea from The Great Divorce.
That hell is a door locked from the inside.
Yes, not God forcing people there, but people choosing separation from God, ultimately getting what they insisted on themselves apart from him.
But there's a way out.
Absolutely. The core Christian message presented is salvation through faith in Jesus specifically, believing he died for our sins and rose again, as Paul lays out in Romans 10.9-11. Confess with your mouth, believe in your heart.
And the final word is?
The choice is yours. God offers reconciliation, but he won't force anyone into heaven against their will.
Okay. So, to wrap up our deep dive into Turek's stealing from God, the core idea we've explored is this really provocative claim, isn't it?
Yeah, that arguments against God often, maybe unknowingly, rely on concepts like objective morality, reason, even the value of science itself, things Turek argues, find their most solid grounding in a theistic worldview.
So even in denying God, you might be using God-given tools, so to speak.
That's the essence of his stealing thesis. We really hope this discussion encourages you, the listener, to think through these arguments and, maybe more importantly, to examine the underlying assumptions, yours and others, in any conversation about God's existence.
And maybe here's a final thought for you to chew on as you go. If Turek is right, or even partially right, that concepts like objective good and evil, or our ability to reason logically, don't really have a firm foundation in a purely naturalistic universe, then what does that actually mean for how we understand ourselves? for the values we hold, for the very way we engage with the world around us. If those things are just, useful illusions or evolutionary byproducts, what does that imply?
That's a big question. Definitely something worth pondering further on your own.